All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Max Young, and I'd like to thank you all on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore for tuning in tonight. Tonight, we are lucky to have with us Tom Zoellner and Caleb McDaniel, who will be in conversation searching for common ideas of slavery and liberty in the US and the Caribbean. And they'll both be talking about their books a little bit. Again, we're incredibly grateful that all of you could make it tonight. Our bookstore is able to continue bringing authors and their works to our community during this difficult time. Tonight's event also includes a Q&A portion. So if you'd like to submit a question, go ahead and click that Ask a Question button down at the bottom. And if you see a question that you'd like, you can go ahead and vote for it, and it'll move up to the top of the list so the authors will answer it first. And lastly, if you're interested in supporting our bookstore, you can go ahead and purchase a copy of tonight's book by clicking the green button right down there. We have both of their books for sale, so you can go ahead and just click it and purchase it if you'd like. And with that all out of the way, let me go ahead and introduce both of our authors. So Tom Zoellner is the author of the book Island on Fire, The Revolt That Ended Slavery in the British Empire, as well as 7 other nonfiction books. He works as a professor at both Chapman University and Dartmouth College. His writings have appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, The American Scholar, The Oxford American, Time, Foreign Policy, Men's Health, Slate, The Los Angeles Times, The New York Times, as well as many others. And Caleb McDaniel is an associate professor of history at Rice University, where he also serves as a magister at Duncan College. He is the author of Sweet Taste of Liberty, A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America, and the Problem of Democracy in the Age of Slavery, in addition to numerous academic articles about the history of slavery, anti-slavery, and emancipation in the 19th century. He's also written essays that have appeared in the New York Times, the Smithsonian, the Atlantic, and Time. So with all that out of the way, without further ado, let's go ahead and introduce both of our authors. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Max. And just to let all you know, I've got this weird reverberation. Everything I say comes back to me in 30 seconds. So I'm going to do this sort of awkward thing of talking into this microphone. And then when it's time to listen, putting it back in. So I apologize for the somewhat fragmentary nature of that. But this is a real privilege to be talking to Caleb, whose book I've thoroughly enjoyed, Sweet Taste of Liberty, the story of Henrietta Wood, one of the very few enslaved people in the United States to get what amounts to partial reparations. That's actually part of the question at the center of the book. And something I've really been wanting to ask Caleb is about this image that keeps showing up throughout the book, a particularly haunting image, which actually begins the book, which is Henrietta Wood, who was born into slavery but gained her freedom in Cincinnati, was then kidnapped and taken away in a carriage with blinders on the windows. And it's a particularly haunting image for the reader. And I wanted to ask Caleb how he conceived of that as an author.
Well, thanks, Tom. It's great to be here with you talking about your book as well. And as long as we're sort of all figuring out this remote life that we're living, we can maybe share some tips. I found on the screen that if I toggled studio sound, that helped the reverb. So I don't know if you see that button when you hover over the screen, but you might turn that off and that might help you a little bit. I'm not sure. Oh, no. Are you back? There you are.
I'm back.
That's better.
And the reverb's gone, like magic.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that question. And thank you as well. And congratulations to you on your book, which I also very much enjoyed reading. And, you know, the image that you mentioned from my book about Henrietta Wood, who was kidnapped and re-enslaved even after she had gained her freedom in the United States before the Civil War, came from an interview that she gave in the 1870s to a journalist talking about her kidnapping. And she remembered being taken in a carriage across the river and the curtains being drawn so that no one could see what was happening to her as she crossed the Ohio River, the border between the slave states and the free states. And subsequently, in another court proceeding about that kidnapping, there was an eyewitness who testified that the curtains had been drawn over the carriage windows when Wood was kidnapped. But to me, it was kind of an evocative image that I think relates to both of our books because as historians, trying to reconstruct the lives of people whose histories and experiences weren't really meant to be preserved for us, at least not by the powerful people who controlled the archives of slavery as they were being built. And so, historians of slavery are often forced to try to sort of catch glimpses of the people that we're writing about through curtained windows, as it were, and not always able to get as clear of a view as we might like to have. And so I thought about that as well as I was reading your book, which of course focuses on Sam Sharp, the leader of the so-called Baptist War of 1831 in Jamaica. And so I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about Sharp and how you came to write this book. Happy Bastille Day, by the way. I think it's maybe fitting that we're discussing this revolutionary figure today of all days. And so how did you come upon this story for this book and get started on Island of Fire?
Yeah, good question. And Bastille Day is indeed appropriate here, given the themes of incarceration and fire, and certainly in the case of the Caribbean Revolution. Sam Sharp, I got to that initially through sugar, through this commodity that rearranged the Atlantic world and provided this horrific monoculture in Jamaica. It was the only thing really that was grown, except for a little side action and pimento and coffee, but really sugar was 99% of it. It was as bleak, unrelenting, and horrible as I might say cotton farming and Natchez, as really well documented in your book, which is part of the ordeal of Henrietta Wood. And so it's kind of a fascination with how this commodity rearranges the globe, creates its own economy, and creates chartless human misery. And in that story is this what's often classified as an attempted revolution in Jamaica, an uprising. But part of the argument, the central argument of my book, was that it was actually a successful revolution. It was put down militarily, but it proved an enormous political success in achieving emancipation throughout the British Empire. And
yeah,
Caleb,
I think you're persuasive in showing that how critical this rebellion was. I mean, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the setting of the book for people who might not be familiar with Sam Sharp and Jamaica. Set the stage for us a little bit in Christmas of 1831.
Yeah, 1831, the Christmas holiday was really the only day that enslaved people were permitted a bit of liberty. It was actually a 2-day holiday known as Junkanoo, which was a way of saying John Canoe. This was a holiday that involved relief from work. The enslaved people dressed up in costumes which were derivative of West African spiritual traditions. They made subtle fun of their masters. They were allowed to drink rum during the day. It was this sort of space of personal and collective liberty that they were allowed. The white people let it happen. They never truly enjoyed it because this was the time when they perceived that the enslaved people might be passing secret messages or plotting something, and that's in fact what was happening. A church deacon named Samuel Sharp had gained the power of literacy, reluctantly by the white overclass, and had been preaching this message. He was allowed to pass from sugar estate to sugar estate to sort of teach Bible lessons, but the message that he preached was this weird fusion of New Testament theology that hit on several verses that really weren't allowed to be preached in Jamaica. Verses such as, no man can serve two masters. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. One of St. Paul's letters, there's neither man nor woman, nor Jew nor Greek, but all are one in Christ Jesus. These types of verses, the masters really did not like them. It hinted that there was a freedom beyond the physical bondage that they were in. Sam Sharp preached these as well as the news, his version of the news, which he had gleaned from ships tossed overboard, newspapers tossed overboard from the ships in Montego Bay, that told him there was actually an abolitionist movement back in Britain. Well, this was news that was censored in Jamaica. And Sam Sharp concocted this message that not only does the Bible say that we're not supposed to be in these chains, but there's people back in England. And in fact, and he sort of fudged this, the king himself, King William IV, has signed freedom papers, and your masters are holding it back. So what we're going to do, Christmas 1831, we're going to sit down. We're going to refuse to work. We're going to do this peaceful sit-down strike. And in his way, he was anticipating the nonviolent methods of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. He instructed all of his conspirators, and there were a number of them, we're not going to hurt anybody. We're just going to ask for fair wages for a fair day's work. This is, an unheard of concept in Jamaica. So on the night of December 27th, that's what they did. But at the same time, some of his followers set fire to structures on plantations, which were called the trash houses. This is where you stored the unused bagasse, called the strippings from the sugarcane that were used to fuel the boilers. Those went up, and a chain of fire stretched across northwestern Jamaica as a signal that the strike was on. But the volunteer militia took it as violent, and what followed was 5 days of harsh crackdowns.
Great, and I think you paint that picture so well, as the title of your book puts it, of those fires being lit, and that, of course, struck terror into the planter class in Jamaica, but also speaks to the coordination of the movement that Sam Sharp had helped to build. That this was a way to signal from one plantation to the next that this general strike or a sit down, as you call it, was beginning. I'm struck by your description, and I was struck when I was reading your book, of the description of this revolution as, in some ways, a precursor to nonviolent civil disobedience or general strikes of later eras. And you talk a little bit at the end of the book about how historians have thought about this particular episode of rebellion in Jamaica. And there's been sort of some disagreement about how to understand Sharp's intentions and what the plan was. And it struck me as a very timely discussion. I think in 2020, as your book is coming out, there's been protests sweeping the United States and really international ones, and we can talk about that in a moment too. The interaction between these uprisings in Jamaica and rebellions elsewhere in the world. But we've seen since the killing of George Floyd, international protests, a focus on the iconography of the Confederacy and reckoning with the history of slavery and white supremacy, and also discussion about means of protest and violence and nonviolence, and when does destruction of property aid a movement? When does it not? So it struck me as very timely to read your book and the discussion of Sharp's movement as initially a nonviolent one, but one that in turning to violence also in some ways had a bigger impact, and as you describe it, enabled some critics of slavery who might not have spoken out as boldly before, particularly the Baptist missionaries in Jamaica who played a role in Sharp's theology and understanding of himself and the New Testament, spoke out a lot more, in part because of the violent turn that this rebellion took, even though the missionaries had warned against that kinds of violence. So I'm just wondering if you could reflect a little bit upon, this place where it seems to me present and past meet in this discussion over tactics and protest and rebellion and violence and nonviolence. Did that occur to you at all as you were writing this book, to think about those present day ramifications or echoes?
Most definitely. I mean, you and I both as historians have sort of been trained to avoid the heresy of presentism, but in some cases it's unavoidable. And there is a mystery at the center of this book, which is, the character of Sam Sharp. He never left any writings in his own words, and so we're sort of left with this kind of reflections of the writings about him and those who knew him to discern exactly what he was. Was he a man of peace or was he a man of war? And there's evidence to support both contentions, that he certainly preached a nonviolent message, but there's also evidence to indicate that he had a plan B, which is to say, if we're attacked, we're going to defend ourselves. And that, we are going to mount up a physical defense. And certainly when the harsh crackdown began, the enslaved people fought back, and impressively so, with military tactics that surprised the British Army, with a ferocity that kept the rebellion going for 5 weeks. And as you point out, without that show of force, without the powerful visuals of the fires, which is every bit a symbol in this book as the carriage is in yours, which is this sort of through line through it. Without that, would the London newspapers have made such a fuss about it? And would this event really have penetrated into the consciousness of the British public at exactly the right time, which is, unbeknownst to Sam Sharp, they were really primed for it. The Reform Act had broken up Parliament, which had been previously this really plutocratic, creaking medieval ship that you had to buy your way into by cornering something called a rotten borough. This was the 19th century version of dark money, or American dark money. And one of the primary groups, you could call them the Koch brothers of the 18th century, were the West Indian sugar growers. They had veto power over anything that would come through Parliament. So the Reform Act broke the back of that. And within a year, here comes Sam Sharp and his rebellion. Here comes, a sort of an awakened sensibility among the laboring classes of the first wave of the Industrial Revolution, who had come to become conscious of their lack of representation and their miserable condition, in some ways comparable to the miserable condition of West Indian slaves, and decided, all right, actually we can have common cause with these people that we've never met, whose images we've only seen in magazines, but maybe there is a common humanity between us. And this was a kind of a remarkable breakthrough for the British at the time.
Well, it strikes me when you talk about the mystery of the book, of sort of what were Sharp's intentions, and I think readers of the book will kind of be drawn into that mystery. He reminded me in some ways of John Brown. I don't know if this has occurred to you, but in the speech that he gives, sort of from the gallows, was reminiscent in my mind of Brown's ability not to waste an opportunity to impress upon the listeners a certain understanding of what his execution meant, and a certain interpretation that would live on, after his death. I wonder if you considered, or if you think it's plausible that he, knew that this show of force would spark a brutal backlash that would ultimately undo the slavery system, much as Brown knew that, in bringing rebellion into the heart of the slave South in 1859 in Virginia would provoke a response from the government that couldn't help but expose how complicit the government was in the maintenance of this unjust institution.
That's a great question. No enslaved person in Jamaica ever spoke louder to Britain as Sam Sharp did. Did he know that he would have that impact? That is a wonderful question. No portrait of him was, of course, ever painted in his lifetime. But the government of Jamaica, when they elevated him to the status of what they call national hero in 1975, commissioned a portrait, and somebody sort of guessed at his appearance based on descriptions of him from those who knew him. And this image now graces the Jamaican $50 bill. And Sam Sharp's expression in this portrait always struck me as almost this sort of Mona Lisa look. You don't quite know what he's thinking. And in that sense, it's accurate to the mystery at the heart of what he was doing. I'm going to hold this up here. This is the page from the book in which the drawing is reproduced. I don't know if that shows, but that's Sharp. And this 1975 portrait kind of gives away nothing of what might have been going on inside. And I really like your John Brown comparison. Not exact, of course, but I can tell you that the two of them shared two things. First, an incredible self-confidence, a conviction that what they were doing was right in the eyes of God, even though others around them thought that slightly crazy. I think Brown was a little bit more insane than Sharp, actually. But the second thing is the charisma and the ability to articulate a simple moral vision that drew people to him and allowed him to accomplish things with group strength that a singular man could not have done on his own.
Well, since we're talking about Brown, maybe you could share with the audience a little bit about the connections between your book and the debate over slavery, not only in the British Empire, but also in the United States. As I was reading, I was reflecting on the fact that Henrietta Wood, who's the subject of my book, was, still a child on the northern Kentucky farm where she was born into an enslaved mother at the same time that this was happening in 1831, a world away seemingly in Jamaica, but still very close. And yet, as you point out in the book, the ways that slavery unraveled in these two national contexts were very different. And on the one hand, Sharp's rebellion definitely echoed in the United States, but also it didn't bring about as swift a conclusion to the problem of slavery in the United States as it did in the British Empire, whereas you argue just a few years after Sharp's rebellion, Parliament passes the West Indian Emancipation Act, and then 4 years after that ends a sort of abortive experiment with apprenticeship as kind of a gradual emancipation scheme. So talk a little bit about how this book relates to maybe a timeline or a storyline that readers might be more familiar with in the United States, and how did it impact the slavery debate in the United States, and why didn't it have a quicker effect in the United States, similar to the one that it had in Parliament?
Right. I mean, the comparisons are always tricky, but this was Britain's version of the U.S. Civil War. This was a violent confrontation that hastened the end of this particular institution. And Britain was able to do it with very little bloodshed and this really awkward political compromise, but also an effective one that did get rid of this institution. It hit the U.S. like a gut punch, particularly the southern U.S. The oxygen in the Atlantic world suddenly became imbalanced. One of the foremost world powers, far more influential than the United States at the time, had just taken this move. And not entirely for humanitarian reasons, too. And if you really want to start a fistfight between historians of British slavery, you ask them this question, did they do it because of a moral conviction, or did they do it because slavery was no longer economically sustainable? There have been books written about books that have tried to tackle this question. Was it economic suicide in a way? And you'll find compelling evidence on both sides. Certainly, if you look at the record of what was said in Parliament, what was said privately, it was a constellation of both. That my conclusion was that it was a very cold-blooded cost-benefit analysis. We're going to have to fight, they said to themselves, the equivalent of a Vietnam War, essentially every 5 years, and probably even more frequent than that if we want to continue to prop up, this sugar economy. We're going to have to put down rebellions which are going to get only hotter and faster. And so why don't we save the drain on the Treasury? And by the way, why don't we look good in the eyes of the world by finally giving into these abolitionist arguments? So, hard to point one cause, but, if you ask me, it really was sort of a colonial office look at the bottom line. All right. So, yeah, this absolutely affected how the United States looked at its own horrific institution. This galvanized abolitionists in the Northeast at William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator newspaper, which was the most consistently radical of the anti-slavery publications. They went nuts. And they realized, they saw what was coming, that this was a blowtorch on the hind end of the U.S. The British began making part of their foreign policy an anti-slavery agenda. They started courting the Texans and, offering them an easy way to, sustaining their nationhood if they would ban slavery. So slaveholding interests went crazy at this. They thought it was a conspiracy on the Brits. So there was huge Anglophobia down in the South. This holiday, which has been unfortunately forgotten, this was the original Juneteenth. It's called August 1st Day. It's the day that Parliament passed the Slave Emancipation Act of 1833, and also the day that full freedom arrived in the Caribbean in 1838. African Americans immediately recognized this is a huge deal. And free African Americans started marching and holding these celebrations in northeastern cities, which scared the pants off of Southern sympathizers. This was African Americans marching in the streets. Talk about your George Floyd comparisons. This was a huge threat. And eventually these celebrations on August 1st became multiracial. Frederick Douglass found common cause with Ralph Waldo Emerson. These kind of trendy New England progressives found a common cause with free people of color on the U.S. frontier in Indiana, Ohio, Illinois. And so August 1st Day became more and more militant right up to the end of the Civil War. And its origin was in Jamaica.
Right. And, you brought us back to the present in a way with that answer. And, this summer, Juneteenth, and was more, it seemed to me that more corporate, C-suites took notice of this holiday than ever had before. And more people were observing Juneteenth, seeing kind of the political meaning of Juneteenth. And of course, the flip side of that is the critical eye that many Americans are casting on our history and the monuments that we erect, the people that we honor, the ways that we remember our history or don't remember our history. And so as I was reading your book, I was thinking partly about those debates as well. You talked about Sam Sharp's image in 1975, but there is also an evocative line from a speech by William Knibb, who was one of the Baptist missionaries in Jamaica, who said after Sharp's death that, if Europeans paid as much attention to enslaved people as they did to great Europeans, then there would be a statue of Sam Sharp in London for people to see. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, especially in the aftermath and epilogue of your book, as you turn to thinking about the legacies of this story, and why and when Sam Sharp has been remembered or forgotten, even in the names that we use to talk about this rebellion, as the Baptist War or the Jamaica Rebellion of 1831. What does this story tell us about which figures get memorialized, lionized, and which don't. Is that something too that this summer you've been thinking about and watching these events play out?
Absolutely. It's worth remembering that the British, of course, wanted to efface all memory of Sam Sharpe once he was hung. You know, they ordinarily would put the heads of rebels up on a pike, and they denied that, and even that indignity to Sharpe, because they just wanted to sweep him under the carpet. You know, they wanted nobody to emulate this guy. Even after emancipation, he was not an honored figure. And you know, his resurrection, so to speak, historically only really took place in the 1970s. This is when a newly independent Jamaica, you know, at that point out from under the Union Jack, just 13 years, trying to sort of come up with a sense of national pride, from a nation which had suffered so much pain, and they sent historians looking for people in their past who could be held up as admirable, and as you know, and as most people listening will know, one of the great tragedies of slavery is the way that these lives went unrecorded. Most of them were not given the gift of literacy. They were not given the tools to tell their own stories. We sort of get these fragments from court records, from newspaper accounts, which always have their own axe to grind. And so, Sam Sharpe is a figure on a statue, which he certainly is in Jamaica. As I said, he's on the currency.
Yeah.
It's fairly new, and it's
this
good.
No, this seems to be you referred to this Jamaica Rebellion as, in a way, Britain's Civil War, although it's interesting that as you sort of do at the end of the book, kind of what you often see at the end of a movie, what happens with each of the main characters. None of the planters who were very involved in this story seem to have come off very well. That seems to be a striking difference in the U.S., where there's still a struggle over whether or not traitors to the nation, slaveholders should be venerated in the form of Confederate monuments. Unless I missed something, it seems like in your book that Little Breeches and what Willoughby Cotton, all of these great 19th century names, don't really have statues or memorials or huge legends attached to them. Is that accurate, or are there people in the book who are kind of still given pride of place in the British memorial landscape instead of Sharpe?
As we speak, there is a debate going on in Jamaica now over the thousands of place names and building names which still bear the the mark of their British colonial history, and so there is a process of historic review going on. The difference, of course, between Jamaica and the U.S. on this question is that almost nobody in Jamaica is really willing to make a loud public stand on the part of these names, and so it would just be a question of familiarity. The street that everyone's called this thing forever. Do we really want to? Is that just going to be confusing? So these same questions are also presented in Jamaica, but with a different dynamic of argument.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's a great question. And
yeah, very interesting. I mean, it does seem that in the British kind of popular imagination, the abolitionists like Wilberforce or Clarkson are the ones who are remembered. So maybe there's a kind of silencing there, just by virtue of who is instead remembered as kind of the lions of the anti-slavery movement, whereas Sharpe, maybe doesn't get his due. And so I hope that readers of your book will come away understanding how important Sam Sharpe was to the collapse of slavery in the British Empire, that it wasn't just the Wilberforces or the Elizabeth Hayricks or Thomas Clarksons, but the enslaved people themselves who resisted their bondage and through their agency, really forced the issue and accelerated the end of this institution. So congratulations again, on really a wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it very much. And I see we have a few questions here that I'll pose to you if you don't mind. One that's gotten some upvotes from Aaron. How aware of the Jamaican revolt were the enslaved people in the American South?
Southern newspapers censored most news of it. The Charleston Mercury, which was one of the sort of most rabidly pro-slavery publications, made this cryptic reference to disturbances in Jamaica and then cut it off from there. It got more attention in the northern press, and people were warily casting an eye because Nat Turner's rebellion had taken place 5 months prior in Southampton County, Virginia. And the sense was, this sort of paranoia. Are they going to be coming for us with the pitchforks? And, that's how the news landed in the Southern consciousness.
Okay, another question here. What were the biggest challenges in researching this book? What, if anything, surprised you?
Great question. And actually, I want to, if I may, draw a parallel between my book and yours, which is the indispensable role of journalism in helping preserve this story. I found the backbone, the narrative backbone, in the long middle section dealing with the military conflict in Jamaica through the press accounts. And I was just, marveling at the perspicacity of 19th century Caribbean newspaper editors. Most of them white, but some of them free people of color who managed to assemble a fairly vivid account of what was going on. And it surprised me that more historians weren't accessing these papers, which are preserved in what's called the National Library of Jamaica. And if I could shout someone out here that's in your book, I found him character second only to Henrietta Wood herself as just a figure of fascination. If I'm pronouncing the guy's name right, Lafcadio Hearn.
That's right.
Yeah, a journalist for the Ripley Bee or the Cincinnati Enquirer?
The Cincinnati Commercial.
Cincinnati Commercial, who was drawn to very strange, gritty topics that no one else wanted to cover. It was considered, I guess, too distasteful for mid-19th century journalists, but he would go to slaughterhouses and drink cow's blood, follow church steeple cleaners around. Like, this guy would have run a hell of a blog, had he been around today, just finding these weird stories. And he was the one who did what must have been an incredibly lengthy story on Ms. Wood.
Yes, and the book, I think, would not have been possible without that interview and also another interview that Wood gave in the 1870s about her ordeal that really told the story in incredible detail, which is, to me, first and foremost, a testament to her powers of recollection and her determination to tell her story. And as I talk about in the book, and as you mentioned briefly at the beginning, she ultimately filed a lawsuit for reparations against one of the men who had enslaved her before the Civil War. And her telling of her story to journalists like Lafcadio Hearn in the 1870s really played a critical role in pushing that case forward and ensuring that it would not die and be dismissed. But you're absolutely right that Lafcadio Hearn was a fortunate journalist for her to encounter, and they might easily not have met because not long after that interview with Wood, he actually left Cincinnati and moved to New Orleans, where he continued his journalistic career. And he's very famous to residents of New Orleans because of a lot of the food writing he did. So he would have had a food blog in New Orleans, but really helped to document Creole culture in New Orleans before ultimately moving to Japan. And he ended his life in Japan as a chronicler of Japanese folktales under a different name. He's now a household name in Japan, sort of what we would think of as kind of the Mark Twain or Edgar Allan Poe of Japan. That's how famous he ultimately became. But when he met Henrietta Wood in the 1870s, he was just a sort of a beat newspaper reporter who, as you say, picked the beats that other reporters at the time found sort of less than respectable, let's say. But that's fortunate for historians because he was willing to go into neighborhoods where impoverished African Americans, who many of whom had experienced slavery and emancipation, lived, and took down their stories. Um, and you know, as you pointed out with the Jamaican newspapers, maybe they've been there for a long time, and historians haven't always made as full a use of them as they could. In the same way, Henrietta Wood's story has been hiding in plain sight, in a way, in the collections of Lafcadio Hearn's writings that are avidly collected by his admirers of his Japanese writings, who have kind of taken down bibliographies of everything he ever published and collect 19th century volumes of those essays, including her story. But I was convinced that it was important to try to run down these details and these names and these facts that Wood remembered, and was stunned to find that there were lots of sources that could corroborate them and expand on them and make it possible to tell a full narrative in the book.
So the lesson to everyone listening is when a journalist wants to talk to you, talk to him. Take the call.
That's right. One of our questions is, what are some ways that American schools can improve how they teach the history of slavery and colonization?
Wow. I can tell you that from what I've been told by my British friends, this story of Jamaican emancipation at the hands of the enslaved people themselves is not well taught in British schools. I mean, it's obviously not a uniform curriculum over there, but as you said earlier, Caleb, they tend to sort of go down the heroic road of Wilberforce and Clarkson and John Wesley, which is a valid story, but it's obviously not the whole story. Part of my goal in writing this book was that Sam Sharp's name should be better known in the English-speaking world and in the United States. You know, we live in a dynamic hemisphere still, and it was, I think, even more dynamic in the 19th century, the interplay between the US and the Caribbean. One question which, you know, I kind of wondered how I would answer it if it were asked, you know, and I'll just answer it right now. Is it really the business of a Caucasian guy from California to go into Jamaica and tell that story? You know, does the identity of the historian play a role here? And I'm sympathetic to that argument, but part of what I had thought was that this was truly a global story. You know, that Sam Sharp was, if I can use the somewhat loaded word, hero. You know, he was an incredibly dynamic figure who deserves to be better known, and his story, it was so powerful that it belongs not just to Jamaica and the larger British Commonwealth, but also the entire world.
Well, I think that speaks to maybe one way of answering the pedagogical question, is that more and more, I think, historians of the United States or British Empire, the Atlantic world in general, understand the history of slavery as integral to that history. That African American history is American history, for example. And so, you know, rather than, as I think many of us, certainly when I was growing up in Texas, would have been taught the history of some of these figures sort of in a sidebar, you know, a box about Harriet Tubman on the side, or maybe in Black History Month, some attention being paid to these heroic names. It sounds like Jamaica is a little bit farther on the education road in the sense of putting Sam Sharp on their currency, which of course, you know, Harriet Tubman still hasn't made it to the $20 bill, despite a movement to make that happen. But I think those kinds of things could make a difference. School children don't learn about history just from their textbooks. They learn about history from the landscape, from who's on the currency, and who's on Mount Rushmore, who's in the town square. And so I think the answer to the question of how we can teach that history better is partly a story about how curricula can change, how textbooks can change. But I think many of our educators are doing a great job on that front. But there's also a part in the civic side of things and the way we teach our history and tell our collective stories that we could do a better job of, to make sure that people like Sam Sharp or Henrietta Wood or Harriet Tubman are better known and remembered. And I think you're right. There's so many stories like this. There's lots of Sam Sharps and lots of Henrietta Woods out there awaiting investigation. And so we need, I think, more histories like this, and more people, willing to write them, to invest resources in doing the research to bring those stories to light.
I agree, and not just the individuals, but also the powerful social contexts that that surrounded them. And I think I've already said one of my favorite portions of your book is laying out what it was like in a southern Mississippi cotton field. It's hard to understand Henrietta's story without understanding that part.
Right. Well, speaking of other stories that remain to be written, another question we had was whether you're currently working on another book. And I know you've just published this. When did it officially come out, Tom?
May 12th.
May 12th. And have you turned your sights to? You're certainly a prolific author, so I'm curious. Do you have your sights set on another story to tell?
Thank you for asking. I'll plug. Things came together really strangely for me on this. That the process of peer review, which you're familiar with. This was my very first time going through it. It took forever, 4 rounds. It was about as pleasant as that sounds. And so it delayed publication and put it pretty close to another completely unrelated book I have coming out in October. It's called The National Road, Dispatches from a Changing America. And so it's a set of 14 essays that attempts to ask the question that so many have asked, what is the United States? But this particular lens is through that of geography, the awareness of America, that we can perceive who we are through the land itself. And so it also attempts to diagnose some of our national sicknesses. The editors let me slip in a coronavirus essay at the last minute, so that's covered. I'm pleased to say that the name of our current president occurs exactly once in the entire book, and it's in a non-political context.
Well, we'll look out for that title as well, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it at Vroman. So thank you to Vromans for hosting us tonight. It really was a pleasure talking with you, and to all of you who came and asked great questions.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Special thank you again to Tom and Caleb for that incredible discussion. Very insightful. I personally learned a bunch of stuff that I hadn't been taught in school before, so I thought that was very interesting. Once again, please consider supporting us more by purchasing tonight's books, just again by clicking that green link down below. But with that all being said, thank you all so much, and we hope you have a great night.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Good night.